We live in a time of fad diets, and people are, they adopt these, various extreme fringe diets, and they tend to make that their identity.
People who are vegan, make sure you know that they're vegan within the first 5 minutes. It's even worse with like the keto fad. I'm so sick of hearing about keto.
A healthy diet can have room for fun foods, foods that might be off limits with these more extreme plans.
I need to know, what is the big deal about seed oils? I feel like every day I'm seeing people either post that seed oils aren't nearly as bad as people are saying, then I have some people telling me that seed oils are the worst thing to have happened to Americans in a long time. So what do you think of seed oils? Well, thank you for joining me today, Max. How are you?
Good, man. Great to meet you.
Likewise. Surviving here in Los Angeles still?
Yes. Surviving, thriving. I love LA. It's easy to find things to complain about, but overall, city's been pretty good to me.
See, I say the same thing. I feel like LA gets a bad rep for understandable reasons, but at the same time, like, as long as you find your space, you find your little pockets of LA that don't drive you insane, where you're not being attacked by crackheads, I think it's a lot of fun once you get past all that.
Yeah, exactly. And I live in a very central area, and it reminds me of home, where I'm from, New York City. So, I mean, I'm kind of used to bureaucracy and all that stuff. So, but yeah, man, and you can't beat the weather.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
True. I'm very anti-humidity, anti-cold, pretty much anti anything that's not like perfect weather at this point. I've only been in LA for like a year and I'm so spoiled.
Welcome.
But hey, thank you. So you had a post that you made that I love where you said that your diet does not need to have a name.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. I mean, we live in a time of fad diets, and people are, they adopt these, various extreme fringe diets, and they tend to make that their identity, right? Like, we've all been to an influencer's social media profile, and either their name has their diet of choosing in their handle, or it's in their bio. And I think that's not how nutrition should work. That's not how we should approach food and our dietary choices, by making them a part of our identity, because our goals and needs change. They're different sometimes one day to the next, and certainly from 1 year to the next, 1 decade to the next. And so by adopting a diet with a name. Now, obviously, there are some like exceptions. If you're on like some sort of ketogenic diet for medical purposes, obviously there's an exception to that. But in general, I think you should always be willing to tinker and iterate. And and for me, for example, like, I've always said that like the paleo diet is a really great place to start, but the paleo diet eschews legumes and things like that, and even grains. And like today, my diet incorporates legumes. I eat the occasional rice, which is a grain, things like that. So I think you ultimately have to find what works for you, which is not something that most diet tribes like to hear. It's like tribalism in nutrition.
It is like a weird, like, undying loyalty to that lifestyle. Like, people who are vegan, make sure you know that they're vegan within the first 5 minutes. Yeah. It's even worse with like the keto fad. I'm so sick of hearing about keto. Yeah. I feel like it's just you're eating greasy meat all the time and nothing else of nutrient or nutritional value. But now you have to tell every single person you know about it. Yeah. I am thinking about doing the hard 75 though, or the 75 hard. What do you think of that?
I don't know what that is. What is
you
that?
don't?
Yeah. What is that?
It's less of a diet. It's more of just like a challenge where like you cut back on you don't eat anything bad. You have to work out twice a day, no alcohol, just like strictly business for like 75 days straight. I feel like that's not too fad-like.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with that, but it does remind me, based on how you described it, of Whole30, which is a very strict, extreme, sort of like a dietary reset. But I don't think that you need to approach dieting like that, to be honest. I think by adopting healthy habits and by shifting your diet intake to a more whole food style diet, it ultimately doesn't even matter so much the specific foods that you choose. Most people today, your average adult consumes upwards of 60% ultra processed foods, which are the package processed, essentially convenience store foods that are shelf stable, super high profit, and usually highly calorie dense, hyper palatable. Those are the kinds of foods that now predominate most Westerners' diets. And I think the more you can shift your diet to a more whole food centric diet, it doesn't matter about like these like super strict like guidelines. Whole foods ultimately are the key, I think. And like the more you can cook at home, the better off you'll be. And I think another problem with these like super strict dietary plans, like the 70 or whatever, or Whole30, is that it tends to make people adopt black or white mentalities about food and nutrition, which, like if you fall off the wagon, you feel like you've screwed up. And I think that that's not super helpful, because, a healthy diet can incorporate, have room for fun foods, foods that might be off limits with these more extreme plans. So, but if you choose to try it, I mean, just for fun, in the name of fun, then I say go for it and just report back. Let me know how it goes.
Yeah, might as well. As long as I stick to it. If you don't hear from me, just know it failed.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
So working here at PragerU, doing like more cultural / political commentaries type of stuff, we get so much hate as personalities. Like I could breathe on camera and someone was going to call me some kind of radical extremist. So I'm curious, like in your world, like do you have people who disagree with you on just your perspective of fitness or nutrition who think that you're just this evil, hateful person? Do you get that kind of hater backlash online ever?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are two types of haters that I get. One are generally like the hardcore vegan zealots. And usually they masquerade as like vegan health experts. But I tend to catch a lot of flack from them because I unapologetically promote omnivory, which is the consumption of both plants and animals, which is actually the biologically appropriate diet for human beings and something that we're highly adapted to. We're highly adaptable. But nonetheless, vegan zealots, they are the perfect archetype to illustrate the kind of person who's made their diet their identity. And so when you promote a diet that is a direct affront to what they've essentially adopted as an identity, they get very threatened. And so those people tend to come out and don't appreciate my work so much because my work is really balanced and tends to be, rooted in scientific evidence and the like. And so, I feel like they don't, because I actually do present a threat to them, like, because I do present, I think, strong arguments against veganism, they tend to get threatened by my work. And they're, so that would be like one of my primary camps of haters. The other camp it comes from like the more egocentric side, like tends to be people who are like in the evidence-based community, which I would consider myself a part of as well, but they, tend to come from a more academic background. And because of, my footprint online, the popularity of my platform, they tend to just be like, I think it's like egotistically, they feel challenged by me, and I'm somebody who hasn't gone through the academic channels. I came up through a completely different path, but I feel like there's a lot of like vitriol and jealousy sometimes that you get online from like these people behind their, social media accounts. They just don't always say the nicest things, which is like, like annoying. And because I do actually, that is a community that I strive to, like to have a seat at the table. And so I think that can be kind of annoying, but, a lot of these like, these evidence-based health practitioners, they feel fiercely, they will fiercely territorially guard their academic credentials. And so when they see this like kid who's trying to have a voice in their field that they've spent all this money, gone into student debt and spent all these years studying, it's like they just feel like threatened by it. And I think that's like problematic, even though I try to reach out and which I do, I reach out, but they'll see a thin slice of something I've said online and they take issue with it. And, so it's a big problem, but I think we all need to have a little bit more understanding and compassion for one another online and realize that we're all just, at the end of the day, fallible humans trying to figure this thing out. Like nutrition, the field that I love and I've chosen to dedicate my life to, is endlessly complex. And if, there's a lot of, there are a lot of people in the space that act as if they know everything and they have all the answers, and they don't, so. And I don't either. So those are my two kind of like primary like camps of haters. And but I think for the most part, like I've been pretty lucky with somebody of my following. Like at this point, the feedback has been mostly positive. Like the response that I get is like the vast majority of the response that I get to my work is like positive.
Nice.
Yeah.
See, it's a good thing that at least most of your haters have a little bit of credibility, like they're worth having a discourse with. I expected it to be honestly the obese crowd that was coming after you. I thought it was going to be people who are just morbidly obese, who are just hating on you because you want them to be healthy. Because I don't know if you saw this, but there was this huge narrative that a lot of mainstream media outlets were saying that fitness is inherently a far-right extremist just mentality and habit. What do you think of that?
Yeah, total BS. I think fitness is incredible, and this idea that the mainstream media is trying to align it with the right is just completely nonsensical to me. But one of the reasons I consider myself apolitical, but I did start to catch a whiff of where politics kind of bleed into the work that I do, is because there is this sort of like messaging regarding like climate protection, for example. And if you adopt a mentality that you care about the environment and the climate, which I do, right? Like I care about the environment. Who doesn't? But then you have to sort of like abide by the tribal rules that sort of govern that agenda, right? And so you have to eat, like suddenly you have to like, if you're not eating a certain way, then you don't care about the climate. If you're not like on a vegan diet and you're not eating the bugs, like you're not like all about that, then suddenly you don't care about the environment. And so that's where politics have sort of bleeded into the work that I do. And I've become like completely aware of it. This like push for more plant-based diets, which like, inevitably, if you push a culture towards a more plant-based way of eating today in 2024, you're promoting inevitably ultra processed foods. You're promoting, a lower protein intake, and all these like things that are not ideal from a nutrition standpoint. So that's where I started to push back on like, this sort of like political, quasi political agenda, and this idea that now fitness is like a right wing, thing is like really problematic. Fitness is so important for all humans, no matter where on the political aisle you find yourself. So important.
Yeah. You really do see politics just bleeding into everything now. Yeah. Someone once looked me directly in the eye and told me that if you're anti-obesity, you're also anti-black.
If you're it's like, what are the mental gymnastics to make a statement like that? Like, makes no sense.
It really doesn't.
Like, walk me through that. Like, how does that work?
I tried to figure it out. I'm like, is it a cultural thing? Is it the food thing? Like, what is it that makes you think? Because I view that as insulting, because it's like, now you're just saying that all black people are fat. It's like, yes, like our food might have a little too much hot sauce, a little much too much seasoning, cholesterol is a bit high, but we're not all obese. But I did get a request from a friend that wants to see specifically your reaction to a video.
Roll a tape.
Swim thick.
Swim thick. Whoa.
And half of U.S. adults to be obese by 2030, with 1 in 4 severely obese.
Wow.
Are you surprised by that? And what do you think of that? And first, I must say, black people are never beating the allegations that we're obese with having swim thick parties. But
oh my God.
That's my 2 cents.
That's like, I mean, that whole, like, if you're anti-obesity or anti-black, it's like a weird form of like critical race theory, which is like the most racist, like critical race theory is like, there's nothing more racist than that, right? Putting people in boxes and like, it's horrible. So yeah, the whole like, health at any size movement, it's absurd to think that obesity is healthy. It's not healthy. There's an obese minority that has, quote unquote metabolic fitness, but that doesn't necessarily persist over the long term, as a person ages. In general, it's not healthy to be obese. I mean, conversely, you have thin people who are metabolically quite unhealthy. It's called TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, essentially is what that stands for. But obesity is not healthy. Now, like, beauty is subjective. Like, beauty is completely subjective. And I think no matter who you are, it's important to love yourself and to love your body and to not feel shame about the choices you've made. But I think people need to make choices with full informed consent. And if they're choosing to be obese because they think it's healthy, that is highly problematic. So, yeah. Now, on the other hand, like, if you see an obese person working out, well, that's great.
Yeah.
if you see
I'm
an
rooting
obese,
for them.
like that's healthy.
Yeah.
Right. Anybody working out, that's healthy.
Mm-hmm.
But if you see, if like, if on the cover of a magazine, there's like an obese person on a couch and the headline is "This is healthy," well, that's a lie.
Yeah.
You know?
See, this is why I have beef with Lizzo. She actually blocked me on Twitter not too long ago because I get sick of her peddling this narrative that she eats so healthy. She does all these healthy things. It's like, no, you don't. And like Lizzo, that's a beautiful woman. She is a beautiful person subjectively. But all that confidence is not going to stop her blood from clotting. And ultimately, I just want her to be healthier. And I want more people to start promoting being healthy and making that normalized and cool again, rather than this movement that we have now where everything needs to be plus size. We need to have quadruple XL size shirts to be available. Because it's like, if you are that many X's up in the large category, like you do not need to be worrying about fashion. You really don't. Like you need to be worrying about something besides. You need to be worried about why you don't fit in an XL. That's what your question really should be.
Yeah. I mean, you can be more or less healthy at any given size, right? But in general, again, like being obese is not, I mean, you're fat. We know that our fat storage sites are adipose tissue is essentially an endocrine organ, a hormone secreting organ, and secretes compounds like pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are, again, like the part of the inflammatory cascade that will lead from everything from pain in your joints to ultimately down the road, some of these inflammatory chronic conditions like heart disease, cancer, dementia, diabetes. And so it's a big problem. And I don't know. Like, I don't think shaming anybody is the solution, but to lie to people, like, I think is a big problem.
Yeah, I agree with that. So when we see here it's saying how so many people are going to be obese by 2030 and so many people already are now, do you think that that's more of an individualized problem where people are just making bad decisions? Or do you think it's a systemic issue because our nutrition industry is just so corrupt with so many processed foods and all these hidden ingredients that people don't know they're consuming?
Yeah, I think the problem is multifaceted. I think today we live, we live in amidst a food environment that is by and large ultra processed, which are basically foods that are hyper palatable, meaning they're so delicious that it's really difficult for your average person to moderate their consumption of those foods. Think of it like your average pint of ice cream. Like, I know that I've gone to the freezer many times, taken out a pint of ice cream, aspiring only to have like a spoonful, and before I know it, I'm looking at the bottom of the pint. Like I've had that experience.
Guilty.
Before. This whole notion of like once you pop, you can't stop. That has that slogan, for Frito-Lay's chips or whatever it was, has scientific backing at this point. We know that these foods are really difficult to moderate, and so 73% of our foods today in the average supermarket are of that sort of food that are hyperpalatable, highly calorie dense, and we know that when a person is only given access to those kinds of foods, they tend to overeat to the degree of about a 500 calorie surplus. And if you eat a 500 calorie surplus every single day for a week, well, that's a pound of fat gain right there. And so the food environment, I think, has become incredibly obesogenic. And then we're fed all of these conflicting messages about what is healthy and what isn't healthy. We're fed, no pun intended, those messages on mainstream media all the time, on social media all the time. So I think we also have this really confusing information environment as well, where people, are confused about whether or not eggs are healthy. Eggs are perfectly healthy. They're incredibly healthy. Red meat, a lot of people are like, well, I've heard red meat promotes diabetes. Nobody is getting diabetes from eating red meat. It's these ultra processed foods that promote obesity, are the primary problem. So, yeah, so I think it's multifaceted, but ultimately, again, like the more a person can just shift their diet away from these ultra processed foods to more minimally processed whole foods, adopting, a protein centric diet, I think is really, really important, and ultimately the antidote to the problems that we're seeing societally. It's not that you have to be low carb, it's not that you have to be low fat, but a whole foods diet that places sort of protein at the center of the plate, I think will go a really long way. That's my sort of guiding hypothesis.
100%. So I want to get your reaction to the difference in the ingredients of the same product, but from the US versus in the UK. So if you look at the US version of the Quaker oatmeal, you will see all these different things. You see Red 40, you see all these different acids and gum and just all these unnatural ingredients and insane amount of sugar, insane amount of oils. But then you look at the UK version and it's just oats, it's sugar, it's fruit, and natural flavoring. So why do you think that in America we have such a problem with that? Can we also look at the ketchup one first, actually? The ketchup one was even more shocking to me because the US version of ketchup doesn't even have real tomatoes in it. It has tomato concentrate. It has not only corn syrup, but high fructose corn syrup and all these kind of salts and spices and things. And then you look over at the UK version and it's like half the list. It's just the tomatoes, the vinegar, sugar, just the basic things that you actually need. So we're at the point now that with these foods, we're not even eating the most basic things. It's like they shouldn't even have a tomato like image on the case if there's not actually a tomato in there.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the reason I think why the UK adults on average eat about 10% less, ultra processed foods than their US counterparts. In the US, about 60% of our calories are from ultra processed foods. Today, it's about 50% in the UK. So they're trending towards kind of the same state of affairs that we are, but yeah, I mean, they do tend to have stricter regulation around these kinds of foods and labeling and stuff like that over there. I don't know why, in the U.S. we're so lax and forgiving, but it probably, all you got to do ultimately, I think, is probably follow the money trail to find your answers.
Seems to be a recurring issue that happens in America. It's like always trace the money.
Yeah.
You want the real receipts.
Follow the money, right? Yeah.
So last couple questions for you. One, I need to know, what is the big deal about seed oils? I feel like every day I'm seeing people either post that seed oils aren't nearly as bad as people are saying. Then I have some people telling me that seed oils are the worst thing to have happened to Americans in a long time. So what do you think of seed oils?
Yeah. So, I mean, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. You have people that are saying seed oils are the worst thing ever and that they are the sole problem for all of the, health ills that we're seeing in the Western world. And I don't think that that's true. On the other hand, you see people in the quote unquote evidence-based community that have seemingly given seed oils a hall pass, that there's nothing wrong with them, that there couldn't possibly be anything wrong with them because we have, a small number of human randomized controlled trials that seem to indemnify them. But again, there's pseudoscience on both sides, right? We don't ultimately know the long-term impact that these oils have on every possible indicator of human health. We do have a small number of randomized controlled trials, and the results are equivocal. I mean, in some of them they show harm to human health, and in some we see that they, might improve biomarkers associated with increased risk for, say, cardiovascular disease. But there was a paper published by Taha, who is a UC Berkeley researcher, I believe. UC Davis, I'm sorry, who sounded the alarm on a number of potential problems that chronic consumption of these kinds of refined, bleached, and deodorized cooking oils might have on, for example, brain health. And, I think these are all worth like paying attention to and continuing to research. But when it comes to like your average person, I don't think that seed oils are the primary problem that they should be worried about. The primary problem is that people should be consuming fewer ultra-processed foods. And seed oils tend to be in ultra-processed foods. That's where you tend to find them. And so by cutting out ultra-processed foods, or at least reducing your consumption of them, you're going to be inevitably eating fewer seed oils. And I think the big wins for most people are just eating foods that are in their more natural state. Mm-hmm. And where you're ingesting a lot of fat, for example, with fried food, you really want to not use seed oils, because seed oils specifically, I mean like polyunsaturated fat dominant cooking oils like canola oil, corn oil, soybean oil. Some people will strawman the argument and talk about the health benefits of sesame seed oil, which actually sesame seed oil is quite healthy and humans have been using it for millennia in certain types of cuisine. But it's these like ultra processed, refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils that, if you're frying food, you want to use an oil that's more heat stable. You want to use an oil like avocado oil, which is great and still an unsaturated fat that we know is beneficial to cardiovascular health. You can use extra virgin olive oil, which is, again, primarily an unsaturated fat. I don't think there's any reason to use, these refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils in your home. And you should certainly be avoiding them in the from the fryer setting in the restaurant, because you don't know how often those oils are being changed, and they're probably being kept at high temperature for an extended period of time. So The long and short of it is more research is needed. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle of those two extremist camps. But ultimately, for most people, the thing to focus on is reducing your intake of ultra processed foods.
Mm-hmm. Well, good to know. I'm still convinced that everything in this country is trying to kill me now.
Yeah, well, in all transparency, I avoid seed oils. I do, but I try to also. But in terms of my own hierarchy, like I'm also avoiding the ultra processed food as best as I can. I try to cook at home as much as I can and use oils like extra virgin olive oil, where there's a lot more evidence on the health benefits as compared to the evidence that we have for these seed oils. So that's just my own like disclosure, but yeah, I think like more research is needed, and these oils are like novel food items. We haven't had them prior to 60 years ago, so I think it's always good to abide by the precautionary principle. The less a food or product or supplement or what have you has been in circulation, with humans being exposed to it, I think the more skeptical we should approach chronic use of that product, because we just don't know. There's not enough information.
And I have one last question for you. So I have to ask you about the white experience.
The white experience.
The white experience.
Okay.
So it is said that if a white person moves out of their neighborhood, that is white flight, that is racism. If a white person moves into a neighborhood, that is gentrification, that is racism. If a white person sees color, that is racism. If you don't see color, then you're ignoring racism, which is racism. If you don't partake in culture, that's non-inclusive, so it's racism. But if you engage in Black culture, that's cultural appropriation, which is also racism. Is it exhausting?
It's exhausting
to jump through these hoops.
Yeah, I love this graphic. Actually, I think it's fantastic, and it just kind of shows you the hypocrisy and the mental gymnastics that of the social justice warrior that we now all have to kind of deal with in one way or another, at least on social media. And I will say that like as a very privileged white person, like I grew up in New York City to great family. I'm taller than 6 feet. I feel like I'm very lucky in many ways, but I also, but ultimately, like everybody, I think has some form of privilege today. If you're alive, you're privileged, right? If you have like 2 feet to walk on, I mean, like not everybody does, right? So like you're privileged. So I think that this is like just, yeah, it's just a form of like crazy finger pointing. And I think being colorblind is amazing. Like I think like to see all people, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. like would have wanted us to do. I think that's like, I don't know why suddenly being colorblind has become a like bad thing, but somebody out there I'm sure will try to school me in the comments, right?
They sure will. You got to be careful out there. I got to say, being Black is an easy life. I don't have nearly as many gymnastics because, people can't disagree with me. I can just tell them that they're racist and, that's just the end of that.
Yeah. I mean, you just get to use the race card, but
yeah, but at least you get Caucasian discounts at like Bass Pro Shop, allegedly.
Yeah, there you go. No, I don't know. I think it's look, I grew up in New York City, man. I went to public school my whole life, so this whole thing now, suddenly we have to like apologize for, and also I'm from a Jewish background as well. So like my ancestry, like we have not had it easy, not that and I don't need anybody to apologize for that either. So, but that's like, for me seeing this, it's just really funny because like, I grew up in a very multicultural environment and, I grew up with like best friends from across the socioeconomic spectrum, and this whole thing now where like, everybody's pointing fingers at one another is just like really sad. And I can't wait till we as a culture move on from this. We're not there yet,
Well, hopefully it's just a fad.
And I'm a cis hetero male, and you can't spell racism without cis.
That is true. That is true.
So I guess I'm just like the devil incarnate.
Let's just hope not.
Yeah.
Because I would never want to sit this close to the devil.
Yeah, let's hope not.
I just went to church a few days ago.
Love it, brother.
Well, Max, thank you for your time, and I'll see you soon.
Xavier, thank you, man. You're the man.